Every town has a place the kids whisper about in hushed tones, and for Stillwater it was Maplewood Cemetery. The cemetery wasn't huge, just a few acres of crooked headstones and rusting wrought iron fences. But it was old, older than the town itself, or so people claimed. "Nothing ever happens there," Colin said, leaning back in his chair and twirling his car keys. "People just like to scare themselves for no reason." Jess, sitting cross-legged on the couch, raised an eyebrow. "Then why don't you prove it?" she asked, her tone teasing but with a sharp edge. Colin smirked. "What, you want me to go there alone?" "Not alone," Jess said. "All of us. Tonight." The room went quiet for a moment. Ava, who had been scrolling through her phone, looked up. "At night? Are you serious?" Jess shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "Why not? We'll bring flashlights. It'll be fun." "Fun?" Ava repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Come on," Jess said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's not like we've got anything better to do." Colin chuckled, tossing his keys in the air and catching them. "All right, I'm in." The others hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. There was Will, the quiet one, who always seemed to be tagging along just to avoid being left out. And then there was Josh, the self-proclaimed tough guy, who rolled his eyes but nodded. "Fine," Josh said. "But if it sucks, I'm blaming you, Jess." They met up at midnight, just outside the cemetery gates. The air was cold and damp, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. Colin had brought a flashlight, and Jess carried a small bag of snacks for the vibe, as she put it. The others came empty-handed, their nervous energy palpable. The cemetery loomed before them, its iron gates slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Creepy?" Ava muttered, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. Colin pushed the gate open with a dramatic flourish, the hinges groaning in protest. "After you," he said, gesturing for the others to go first. Jess rolled her eyes and stepped through, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "See? Nothing to be scared of," Colin said, his voice louder than necessary. "Yet," Jess added, her grin barely visible in the dim light. They wandered deeper into the cemetery, weaving between headstones and low-hanging branches. Some of the graves were so old the inscriptions had faded, the stones leaning at odd angles like crooked teeth. "Over here," Josh called out, shining his flashlight on a large mausoleum near the back of the cemetery. It was made of weathered stone, its iron door slightly ajar. "Dare you to go in," Josh said, smirking at Will. Will shook his head, his face pale. "No way," Jess laughed, stepping forward. "Don't be such a chicken." She pushed the door open, the hinges screeching loudly, and shone her flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a small, empty chamber with cobwebbed walls and a cracked stone floor. "Nothing but spiders," she said, stepping back and letting the door swing shut. "See? No ghosts, no ghouls, no." A loud thud cut her off, the sound echoing through the cemetery. Everyone froze, their flashlights darting around in search of the source. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Probably just an animal," Colin said, though he didn't sound convinced. Another thud followed, louder this time, coming from deeper in the cemetery. Jess's flashlight beam landed on a tree, its gnarled branches casting long, spindly shadows. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice tinged with both curiosity and nervousness. "You're insane," Ava hissed. "Maybe," Jess replied, already moving toward the sound. The others followed reluctantly, their footsteps hesitant and uneven. As they approached the source of the noise, they noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, colder, and the wind had stopped entirely. "Do you feel that?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Jess asked, though she already knew. The sense of being watched was unmistakable, a prickling at the back of the neck that made everyone glance over their shoulders. They reached a cluster of headstones, and Jess's flashlight landed on something that made her gasp. A fresh grave. The dirt was loose, uneven, as if it had been dug up recently. But there was no headstone, no marker, just an empty patch of earth. "Okay, that's creepy," Josh said, stepping back. "Who buries someone without a headstone?" Before anyone could answer, a faint sound reached their ears. At first, it was barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on wood. "It's coming from over there," Jess said, her flashlight pointing toward a row of large, ancient trees. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by a sound that made everyone's blood run cold. Laughter, high-pitched and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the trees. "Who's there?" Colin shouted, his voice breaking. The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the cemetery into an oppressive silence. Then, from the darkness beyond the trees, a figure stepped out. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow, but its movement was deliberate, purposeful. "Run," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible, but no one moved. The figure took another step forward, and the beam of Colin's flashlight landed on its face. It wasn't a face. It was a mask, white and expressionless, with hollow black eyes and a thin, painted smile. The figure raised its hand, and in it was a shovel, its blade stained dark with something wet. The masked figure stood perfectly still, the shovel held loosely at its side. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves, stirred by the faintest breeze. Who is that?" Will stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably some weirdo trying to scare us," Josh said, though his bravado sounded forced. Jess tightened her grip on the flashlight, her hand trembling. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. It just tilted its head slightly, as if studying them. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. "That's it. I'm out," Ava said, turning on her heel and starting back toward the cemetery entrance. "Wait," Jess called after her, but Ava didn't stop. She broke into a run, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. The rest of the group hesitated, torn between following her and staying to confront the figure. Then the masked figure moved. It wasn't a run or a lunge. It was a slow, deliberate walk, each step eerily measured. "Go!" Jess shouted, grabbing Will's arm and pulling him toward the gate. Colin and Josh were right behind them, their flashlights jerking erratically as they ran. The crunch of gravel under their feet was deafening in the otherwise silent cemetery. By the time they reached the gate, Ava was nowhere to be seen. "Ava!" Jess called, her voice echoing in the stillness. No response. "Where'd she go?" Will asked, his voice shaking. Colin shone his flashlight down the road, but it was empty, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing nothing but asphalt and trees. "She couldn't have gotten far," Colin said, though he didn't sound convinced. Josh, breathing hard, turned back toward the cemetery. Where's the guy?" They all looked back, their flashlights sweeping over the tombstones and trees. The masked figure was gone. "Let's get out of here," Jess said, her voice firm. "We'll find Ava and go home." They started down the road, sticking close together, their flashlights cutting small circles of light in the pitch-black night. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional distant rustle of leaves. "Do you think that guy was real?" Will asked hesitantly. "What do you mean?" Colin replied. "I mean, what if it's just some prank? Like, someone in a mask trying to scare us?" Josh snorted. "Yeah? Then explain the shovel. That wasn't a prop." Will fell silent, his face pale in the dim light. They walked for what felt like hours, but Ava was nowhere to be found. "She couldn't have gone this far," Jess muttered, stopping to catch her breath. Colin glanced around, his flashlight beam sweeping over the trees. "Maybe she went back to the car? Without us?" Jess asked, frowning. A faint sound interrupted their conversation. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere to their left. "Not again," Will whispered, his voice trembling. They all turned toward the sound, their flashlights aimed at the trees. For a moment, there was nothing. Then they saw it. A figure, partially obscured by the shadows, standing just inside the tree line. It wasn't the masked man. This figure was smaller, its outline more familiar. "Ava," Jess called out, taking a cautious step forward. The figure didn't move. Jess hesitated, her heart pounding. "Ava, is that you?" The figure stepped into the light, and a collective gasp escaped the group. It was Ava, but something was wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused, and her clothes were smeared with dirt. "What happened?" Jess asked, rushing forward. Ava didn't answer. She just stood there, staring past Jess at something in the distance. When Jess reached her, she gently shook Ava's shoulder. "Ava, talk to me." Finally, Ava's lips moved, her voice barely audible. "He's watching." Jess froze. "Who's watching?" Ava turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto something behind the group. The others turned too, their flashlights landing on the masked figure, standing in the middle of the road, the shovel resting on his shoulder. This time they didn't wait. "Run!" Jess screamed, grabbing Ava's arm and pulling her along as they took off down the road. The sound of footsteps followed them, heavy and deliberate, the crunch of gravel echoing like a death knell. The group ran until their lungs burned, their legs threatening to give out. When they finally stopped, the masked figure was gone again. Ava collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling. "What the hell is going on?" Josh demanded, his voice shaking. No one had an answer, but deep down they all knew the truth. This wasn't over. In the distance, back toward the cemetery, the faint sound of laughter echoed through the night. The laughter faded into the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The group stood frozen in the middle of the road, their flashlights trembling as they scanned the darkness. "Did anyone else see him?" Jess whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Ava nodded, her face pale and streaked with tears. "He was standing right there, at the edge of the woods, just watching us." "No," Josh muttered, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of it all. "No way. He can't just keep appearing and disappearing like that." "He's toying with us," Colin said, his voice tight. "And it's working." Jess turned to Ava, gripping her shoulders. "Ava, are you okay? Can you keep going?" Ava nodded weakly, but her legs wobbled as she shifted her weight. "We can't stop," Jess said, her voice firm. "We have to keep moving." The group started walking again, sticking close together as they made their way down the dark road. The oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Colin glanced over his shoulder every few seconds, his flashlight darting across the woods. "Do you think he's still out there?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Josh scoffed, though his bravado sounded forced. "Of course he is. Guys like that don't just give up." Jess shot him a glare. "Stop talking like you know what's going on. None of us do." They walked in tense silence for several minutes before Ava suddenly stopped, her flashlight beam shaking as she pointed to something up ahead. "What's that?" she whispered. The group froze, their lights converging on a dark shape lying in the middle of the road. As they got closer, their stomachs turned. It was a dog, its fur matted with blood, a deep gash across its throat. "Oh my God," Jess whispered, covering her mouth. Ava turned away, tears streaming down her face. "It's a warning," Colin said grimly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "He's leaving it for us." "Why?" Will asked, his voice trembling. "To scare us," Colin replied. "And it's working." Josh crouched beside the dog, his jaw tightening. "Look at this." He pointed to the ground beside the animal, where a trail of bloody footprints led off the road and into the woods. "They're fresh," he said, his voice low. Jess shook her head. "We're not following them. We're staying on the road." "Agreed," Colin said quickly, glancing nervously at the trees. They stepped around the dog and kept moving, their pace quickening as their fear grew. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly behind them, growing louder and more deliberate with each passing second. "Did you hear that?" Will whispered, his flashlight darting toward the woods. Jess nodded, her heart pounding. "He's following us." "Run," Colin said, his voice tight with fear. They broke into a sprint, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran down the road. The footsteps quickened, heavy and unrelenting, as though the masked man was right behind them. Jess risked a glance over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. The masked man was there, his shovel dragging along the ground, the blade catching the moonlight. "Don't stop!" she screamed, grabbing Ava's arm and pulling her forward. The group ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they might give out. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they realized they were no longer on the main road. They had veered off onto a narrow dirt path that cut through the woods, the trees closing in around them. "Where are we?" Ava asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jess admitted, her flashlight sweeping over the dense trees. "We took a wrong turn," Colin said, his voice tight with frustration. "We have to go back," Jess said. "Back where?" Josh asked, gesturing to the darkness around them. "We don't even know where we are." A faint sound interrupted their argument. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like metal on stone. They all turned toward the noise, their flashlights trembling. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, until it was joined by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. From the shadows, the masked man emerged, his shovel resting on his shoulder, his head tilted slightly. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and distorted by the mask. Colin grabbed Jess's arm. "We have to run." "No," Jess said firmly, her fear giving way to anger. "We're not running anymore." She stepped forward, her flashlight beam fixed on the man. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised the shovel and pointed it at her. "This isn't a game," he said softly. Jess swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man tilted his head again, his mask catching the light. "It's justice," he said simply. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words sinking in. Before they could respond, the man took a step forward, his shovel dragging along the ground. "Run," he said, his voice cold and commanding. This time, they didn't hesitate. They turned and sprinted down the path, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The sound of the shovel scraping against the ground followed them, relentless and unyielding. As they ran, Jess realized with a sinking feeling that no matter how far they went, they couldn't escape him, because he wasn't just following them. He was leading them somewhere. The group scattered into the woods, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they ran in different directions. The oppressive darkness swallowed Jess almost immediately, the branches clawing at her arms and face as she pushed forward. She could hear her own ragged breathing, the pounding of her heart, and the footsteps. The masked man wasn't far behind her. Jess's flashlight flickered and dimmed, the beam barely cutting through the blackness. She stumbled over a root, catching herself just in time, and pressed on. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew no one would hear. The woods seemed endless, and the thought of losing the others gnawed at her. She had no idea where Ava, Colin, Will, or Josh had gone, or if they were even still alive. A snapping twig behind her sent a jolt of terror through her body. She turned, the dying light of her flashlight catching a faint glint of metal in the darkness. The shovel. Jess spun back around and ran, her mind racing. Think. Up ahead, she saw a faint glow, a break in the trees. She pushed herself harder, desperate to reach it. She burst into a clearing and stumbled to a stop. It was the cemetery. The crumbling headstones loomed like ghosts in the moonlight. The wrought iron gate stood ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Behind her, the footsteps slowed. The masked man stepped into the clearing, his shovel dragging through the dirt with a low, grating sound. Jess backed away, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He tilted his head, his mask catching the pale light, and raised the shovel. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and distorted. Jess's hand tightened around her flashlight. "We didn't mean to. We were just kids messing around." He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "You trespassed," he said. Jess's back hit a headstone and she froze. "We didn't hurt anything," she cried. "Just let me go." The masked man paused, his head tilting the other way. "There's no going back," he said softly. Before Jess could respond, another voice rang out. "Put it down." Jess whipped her head around to see Colin stepping into the clearing, his flashlight trained on the masked man. "Colin!" Jess cried, her voice filled with a mix of relief and terror. The masked man turned, his body tensing. "You shouldn't be here either," he said. Colin stepped closer, his hands trembling but steady enough to keep the light aimed at the man. "You don't have to do this," Colin said, his voice firm. The masked man raised the shovel. "I do," he said simply. Jess screamed as the man lunged, but Colin was ready. He threw his flashlight, hitting the man square in the chest. The masked man stumbled, dropping the shovel with a dull thud. "Run!" Colin shouted, grabbing Jess's arm and pulling her toward the gate. They sprinted through the cemetery, the sound of the man's footsteps close behind. The gate was just ahead, its rusted hinges swinging as the wind picked up. Jess and Colin pushed through it, their feet pounding on the gravel road beyond. Behind them, the masked man stopped at the gate, his silhouette outlined by the moonlight. He didn't follow. He just stood there watching them, the shovel back in his hands. "Why isn't he chasing us?" Jess whispered, her chest heaving. "I don't care," Colin said. "Let's go." They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town, their legs burning and their lungs gasping for air. The next day, the police found Ava and Will, both shaken but alive. Josh was still missing. The cemetery was searched, but the masked man was nowhere to be found. The locals claimed they'd never seen or heard of him before, and the town's records didn't list anyone living near the cemetery. But Jess and Colin knew the truth. He wasn't a ghost or some figment of their imagination. He was real, and he was still out there.